Hi, welcome to The Upside. I'm your host, Paul Santinello. Today I'm by myself for the first part of the show, and then we'll go to bring our guest in a little bit later. Today I want to talk about a couple of things while we have some time. The first thing we're going to talk about is a survey done of our police department by an outside firm to take a look at the quality control, more or less, or quality of the responses by our police department to the citizenry. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the budget, and we'll go on from there. And if we have to do a second part of the show, we will do that. One of the things that this study that came out, and we will have the police chief on in a future meeting and talk about this. I'm going to give it the 30,000-foot overview. But basically, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being terrible service, 5 being the best service that could possibly be delivered, the overall ranking of the police department from the survey was a 4.58. And if you think about that, the number, even though it might not have been the perfect 5, and I'm sure that's what the chief would tell you that he's going to strive for and does strive for, but when you look at it, the overall quality of service being delivered by a police department to the citizenry when they're dialing the 911 number is excellent, as far as I can read from these numbers. Some of the quotes that are in here are pretty amazing, and I'm not going to go through them because I don't want to reveal anybody's names or anything like that. But there were a significant number of calls analyzed, and questionnaires were sent out and followed up by this group that conducted the survey. So again, I'm going to have the police chief Ciano in to talk about that. We've had a good amount of change in our police department with people retiring and moving to other communities. So to maintain that high level of service while bringing in a whole new group of people, to me, it's a great job. And it's one of those positive things that we have going on here in the town of Longmeadow. We have excellent schools, we have great public safety, and our quality of life is dictated by those two aspects for the people that live in town. What I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about the budget. Today, as we're taping this, it's March 2nd. There hasn't been any real discussion through the select board of the budget at this point in time, and there probably isn't going to be for at least another 10 days, at least by the schedule. So by the time you see this, we'll just about start talking about the budget. The interesting highlights, and the budget, let me go backwards. The budget directive, as voted on by the select board, to be given to the town manager to pass on to all departments, including the school department, police, fire, and so forth, was that there would be a 0% increase in line items, with the exception of COLAs. I'm sorry, not the COLAs, steps. The steps are contractual obligations, in other words, meaning if there was a COLA that was awarded last year that was going to be paid this year, those things had to be taken into consideration because we had to honor those commitments via the contract. So 0% increase with the exception of contractual obligations, and if there was anything above that 0%, so if anything came above that, and it was a 0% per department at the bottom line of their line item. So if the police department budget was over by $50,000, which they are over this year from last year's budget, they're buying the 3rd police car because they go on a cycle of buying 2 police cars, and then 3 police cars. They have to turn them over because of the mileage. So this is the year where the 3rd vehicle comes in. That's the justification for that increase in that particular line item. So keep that in mind, that the directive was 0% besides contractual obligations, and if there was anything above that, that means you have to come back, be presented to the town manager, who would then present it to the select board to say, here's the increases and here's the justification for those, and then our board was going to vote on those in whatever manner. The goal of that 0% increase is in FY13. We're in FY12 right now, fiscal year 12. In fiscal year 13, which starts July 1st, the majority of the high school bond payments will start to hit up. The biggest number of that will hit up on the tax rolls. Okay, so the idea was if we could mitigate that by keeping the increase in spending to a minimum, then that would help lessen the impact to the citizens of Longmeadow. So that was the reasoning, the rationale that was given by the finance subcommittee to the select board. The select board voted on that. The directive went out. As of the budget document that was presented to the select board by the town manager, the increase that we are looking for is a little over $1 million, which really didn't fit with the budget directive a whole heck of a lot. So in other words, what happens in Longmeadow is that we can, in any community in Massachusetts, because of Proposition 2.5, is that we can raise your property taxes 2.5% per year without any reason why, because that's the levy limit we can raise. That's what the law says. Anything above 2.5%, it has to be voted on by you, the citizens, at an election, okay, or at the polls. So we've had Proposition 2.5 overrides. A few years ago, there was one. The high school is what they call a debt exclusion. It's a little bit different. Debt exclusions goes away. That goes away when the debt is paid. A Proposition 2.5 override stays in the budget and stays in there and grows with the budget, okay? So there's a difference. A debt override like the high school goes away when the bill's paid. A 2.5 override stays in the budget forever and ever. So what that means is we gave a directive where we wanted to see less than 2.5, somewhere between 0 and 2.5 spent, hopefully on the lower end, below 1. And then we knew there was going to be some things that we're going to have to add into that budget that were needed, like the third police car. Like some items that the school wanted, for example, and something that maybe the fire department needed or whatever. But the directive was kind of blown through the water, the reality, because we went over 2.5%, and I believe we are at 2.63% in total increase in the budget. The interesting thing that the public, needs to know is that none of this includes any cost of living adjustments. So steps are included, and steps are contractual obligations, which means when employees hit a certain anniversary date, they get a pay raise. A lot of employees there's a good number of employees in town what they call maxed out, stepped out, where they've already hit the highest possible step. So we've kind of blown through that budget projection as it stands right now, and that's where the discussions that are going to have to come into play as to what are we going to have to be able to keep in that budget. At this time, at this airing, we are trying to set up a meeting between the joint finance subcommittees of the school committee and the select board to talk about this gap of what the projection was supposed to be like and where we are. Some of the things that were some of the highlights in there is that we're looking to have increases in the school budget. There were some grant money that the schools no longer are receiving that they are seeking to be picked up by the general fund. And the school department has two different sources of revenue. One is general fund, which are your tax dollars, our tax dollars, and then they have grants and gifts and so forth, like from LEAF and stuff. But the LEAF doesn't go into the budget. I don't want to say that. But they do have grants, and the grants could be or special ed reimbursement. And they had a reduction. The school department had a reduction in those grants, in one of those grants to the tune of about I believe about $250,000 or $300,000, somewhere in that range. And they're looking for the general fund to pick that up and, in other words, keep those people staffed and employed, even though the grant money was lost. So that was an increase in there. There's an increase in technology spending by upwards of over $200,000. As part of the overall technology plan, the technology, the IT was consolidated under the school budget. So now that any spending on IT there's no longer by departments, it's for the whole town, but that's now included in the school budget. Those items have been moved over, but there's still an additional increase of almost $200,000 besides those line items moved over. On the town side, we know that there is an increase where the fire chief is asking for a deputy chief to be named and reduce the staffing by one captain. So there's a shift there. We're looking for, there was an HR audit, an audit of the Human Resources Department, which basically said we are understaffed, significantly understaffed in that department. The paperwork requirements coming through the federal government, state government, through HIPAA laws and things like that has just been constantly increasing, and they're starting to fall a little bit behind. So the audit recommended X number of employees, and I know in the budget there's at least requests for, I believe, 1.5 of those employees. But 1.5. There's some things that you'll hear about in the budgets when you hear the talk about FTEs, which are full-time equivalents. So you'll see in the school budget, they made a presentation to the finance committee. I think there was 2.72 FTEs reduced in one line item. A 0.72 FTE is basically based on hours. So when you hear that, it's not an actual person that's being reduced. It could be several people that may be reduced, and sometimes it could be as simple as one. But in other words, what you need to keep in mind is we have no COLAs in there, no raises. All of our town contracts on the school for the teachers and the non-teachers, that they call them Unit A, Unit B, and so forth, to police, fire, DPW workers, clerical, all of those contracts expire on June 30th. So we're all in negotiations. All of our departments are starting negotiations, if they're not in them already, for any potential future raises. Most of our departments, if not all of them, settled for at least 2 zeros in the last 3-year contract, where it was a 0% and 0%. And the last year, most of them had a 1% increase in this current year that we're in, across the board as an average. The COLAs that are not included in this budget could be significant to the point of potential override as a way to fund them, or going after some sort of free cash or stabilization fund, in which case it would still have to have an override possibly at the end of next year. Basically, what we're also looking at is to fund the budget. So the budget is over about $1 million over what the original directive was, roughly. But in addition to that, we're funding the budget with $335,000 from free cash, which means that next year, as you go into the budget by funding it with $335,000 with free cash, is that you're lacking $335,000 in revenue to pay for, revenue being tax dollars, to pay for the programs that are in this budget. So net, when you look at it all, we exceeded the 2.5% levy limit. We have to fund some of this budget with free cash. Structurally, it's probably not the greatest budget that I've seen presented. Unfortunately, we haven't had the ability to talk about it at our select board meetings because it hasn't been on the agenda. One of the things that you'll see is that there's small increases in clerical and in the planning and community development budgets. These are very, very minor increases of like $3,800, but it's departments, especially in the planning, anything to do with planning and planning board, where paperwork has to be filed and there's consequences legally if things aren't done correctly. These are minimal, and again, that may be a justification that's voted on by the board. There's also an increase in field and grounds maintenance. If you've watched select board meetings, you've known over the last probably 4 or 5 years that there's been an increase in demand in providing for better quality playing fields. The one that comes to everybody's mind is Turner Park, where Turner Park went to citizens donated, individuals in coupling with money from the town and booster clubs and making those fields very nice fields. To last year when the well went down, the motor of the well went down, and the grass died, and now it's looking like it's coming back. So you know that there's been some issues about the quality of the fields, the height of the grass, the how many times it's mowed, and just the quality of the infields on ball fields and in the football fields and so forth. So there's an increase in that budget for increased grounds maintenance, but it's only seasonal. It's a seasonal worker, which means they're not benefited, and I believe that's about $26,000. Also, one of the nice things in the budget this year is that there's going to be a reduction in employee benefits because of the mandate from the state to go to whether or not we would go into the GIC, which is the state insurance, versus the Scantic Valley Regional Trust, which we're part of. We were able to go back to Scantic Valley as a town, as one of the members of Scantic Valley, and say, you need to come in line with the GIC, or we are forced by law to go to the GIC. With that, with the raising of some of the deductibles and the co-pays, the town is going to save about $287,000. There's a mitigation where some of those savings have to be by law given back to the unions, their membership, the employees of the town, to the point where it's going to save us probably a net of about $150,000 or so next year's budget. Also, the town manager is recommending that we fund OPEB, which is the other post-employment benefits line, again, that you might have heard about in the last few years, where there's been a great emphasis put on that by the Finance Committee and the Audit Committee. We've been funding it at town meetings with some free cash that's been left over, to where it's going to be recommended that $50,000 be funded through in the operational budget this year. And again, that's a discussion that the town is going to have, that the select board, the finance committee is going to have. This is a liability that every city and town in Massachusetts and the state is facing, to where we have underfunded our requirement to employees who retire. So right now we're funding our current employees, and then we're also funding our past employees, our retirees, and we're doing a double funding. What the OPEB trust is that we have established in town is that there's a number that we need to get to down the road to be completely compliant with it and fully funded. But we are, I think, one of 6 municipalities in the state of Massachusetts that is actually doing this, meaning the other 345 are saying it'll take care of itself somewhere down the road. So that's why it's been a recommendation of the audit committee and the finance committee to say, hey, look, take a look at this. We might need to address it. We should be addressing it so that we are not caught with our pants down 20 years down the road and have to have some sort of override to fund this. The debate about it is, we're either one of the 6 smartest communities in the state of Massachusetts or one of the 6 foolish communities in the state by actually funding this when no one else is. I believe the overall, in talking to other selectmen from other communities, is that the belief is that the state is going to come in here, somehow wave the magic wand and fix this issue, which I don't believe is going to happen. I think having OPEB being funded is a good idea. Our OPEB liability being funded is a good idea. The question is, and the debate is, do you fund it operationally, meaning a line item in the budget every year, and what are you going to cut to fund that OPEB liability? Meaning, just because we want to fund it by $50,000 or $100,000, obviously we don't have the money this year. We have to fund the budget by $335,000 of free cash. So $50,000 going on OPEB is part of that $335,000. And it might not be coming directly out of that $335,000, but it's part of it. So do you fund it operationally, or do you fund it in the fall town meeting with certified free cash? By the way, that's the worst terminology that could ever been brought upon us by the state or given to us by the state. Free cash is not free. What that means is that we over budgeted, and then at the end of the year had a surplus. So by free cash, it means it's not tied to, when the state certifies it, it is no longer tied to any of the line items, and we can use that money for whatever we need to use it for. Under the state law, we are not allowed to transfer line items. So if we need $50,000 from the police department to purchase something over at the fire department, and we know the money's available in the police budget, we can't move it over here to the fire department until we have that certified free cash and have a warrant article and so forth at town meeting. And usually that's done in the fall. We do financial housekeeping in the fall town meeting by utilizing some of this free cash and so forth. So it's not free. It means that we over budgeted. And if you look at the amounts of free cash, it's been one of my pet peeves since I got on the finance committee, which was the appropriations committee 9 years ago, is that we are constantly, when we over budget, folks, what this means, plain and simple, is we have overtaxed you. Okay, so we end up with $1 million of free cash in a $52 million budget, of which there's about $40 million or so of it is general fund money. The other $10 million or so are grants and so forth that the school department receives. That's about equal to about the 2.5% that we constantly raise your taxes by, which is why, if we go back to the original budget directive, we wanted to see a 0% increase, because we have been over budgeting. And when you get that $1 million back in free cash, it's just like paying your bills at the end of the month. If you budgeted, $10,000 for your business bills every month, and you came back and you had $2,000 left over, it didn't mean that money's now free. It just means that we over budgeted. And what we should be going back and looking at and saying, what did we over budget? But we don't do that, because these things aren't on the agenda. And they should be on the agenda more and more, but they're not. But that's what we should be looking at, is what line items were overfunded during the year, and why are we refunding them again this year? That's what the good budgeting would go back and take a look at that and say, well, in X line item, we budgeted for 30 employees. That's the president calling. Excuse me. But the bottom line is, and we don't take his calls in this show, after the show we'll give him a call back. But the bottom line is that when you over budget like this, okay, it comes back in terms of free cash. The problem that I have with that is we spend it. Okay, so we raise your taxes 2.5%. We're basically coming back with 2.5% of the money back. If you look at it consistently over the last 7 or 8 years, with the exception of maybe 1 year in the last 8 or 9 years, that we've had about $1 million of free cash. We then take that free cash, roll it back into the budget, or we spend it, which means that we're spending on items that we didn't plan to budget for. And you say, well, you know, you're creating a budget in February, and the budget really doesn't start until June. But the reality, folks, is our budget is 80% salaries. 20% is really discretionary to a degree, because you still have to pay to light the buildings, heat the buildings, and all that other fun stuff. So when you look at the budget, 80% is salary, 70-80% is salary. The remainder is what they call discretionary, meaning, you know, you don't want to buy the piece of paper to print the budget on. You don't want to light the buildings. You want to turn off the heat. Okay, that's fine. But the reality is that out of that is where we're coming up with these free cash numbers. It is probably one of the worst budgeting techniques that I see. Political people, administrators celebrate the fact that we have all this free cash. It might be through good, proper budget maintenance and looking at the budget and say, hold off here and don't buy this. But the reality is that we're taking the best guess we can in February and March, having the budget voted on in the May town meeting, and then implementing that budget. But again, the pet peeve part of it isn't the fact that we are over budgeting. The pet peeve is that we don't go back and say, what happened to these line items and why did that money come back from it? And it could be something as simple in our police department where we've had, you know, turnover, and you have someone retiring in a higher end salary and coming in at the starter salary, and that's where you get some of that free cash. Well, that doesn't happen every year, and you need to, you know, need to know those things. But more importantly, you need to hear us talking about those things. So when we get to the heart of the matter, and I'm going to pause here because we're going to have our second part of the show coming on, but we're going to have a fuller discussion about the budget. What you need to know before we start having these budget discussions is that two things. One is the budget is out of whack this year. It didn't meet the budget directive of 0% with some justifications because all the money was lopped into that. And we're funding part of this with free cash. So hopefully within the next few weeks, because we have to vote on the budget, I believe on the 19th or 20th, I believe we have to vote on it by the budget calendar that was approved by the Select Board School Committee and Finance Committee by the 19th of March to give it to the Finance Committee so that they can hold their public forum and then vote on the budget. And then it goes to print for a town meeting, which I believe is May 8th this year. So with all of that said, keep tuned to hear to select board meetings, finance committee meetings, to hear us talk about this budget and seeing what we're going to end up with before we present it to you, the public, at the May 8th town meeting. Thank you for watching. Again, we'll have a more complete show about the budget, and we'll bring in some other people to talk about it. Also, I'm going to bring in the police chief to talk about the survey that was done about his department, and we'll be right back with our next guest. Thank you for watching. Welcome back to The Upside. I'm your host, Paul Santinello, where we talk about the good things that go on in town of Long Meadow. We're going to deviate a little bit today because we just talked about the budget previously. We're going to talk about mixed martial arts. It's about some of the good stuff that's going on in Long Meadow. It's happening everywhere, folks, on every street corner here in town. With me today is my guest, Karen Wesch. Karen, hi.
Hi.
There we go. And Karen, excuse me, Karen is a mixed martial arts promoter. And I know that might seem excuse me, a little bit oxymoronic that we have a woman who's promoting in the mixed martial arts field. How I came across Karen was through a couple of Long Meadow High School graduates who still live here in town that were fighting on one of Karen's shows that she was promoting. So before we begin, I just want to show the folks of this was the guy, what he looked like after he just won the belt on your show, your last show, okay? So this was the guy. This is what mixed martial arts is really all about. This is how they end up, folks, by the time they're done. So you see, that's Ricardo, isn't that the guy? Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
It's a great sport. It's one of those sports they call it the cage, where they put people in, and there's good reason for that. So let me ask you, we're going to start off with again, it came through because there's a couple guys from Long Meadow that I know that were boxing or fighting on your show. How does a woman get involved in mixed martial arts?
I think that there's not a lot of women in this sport, in the business aspect of it. I think that it's kind of a guy's man sport, so to speak. I think women started breaking through in mixed martial arts, actually fighting, I believe is where it started, where men started looking at it as kind of a man-woman sport versus just a man sport. And I'm not really into fighting, but I knew that that's a huge industry, and I thought it would be beneficial for me to kind of get involved a little bit and see where I could get my niche into it. So I started with sponsoring fighters with Need to Bleed Fightwear. It's a clothing brand that I have, www.needtobleed.tv. And I started growing from there, and then I started managing fighters. Once I got to know the sport, be around a lot of those fighters on a regular basis, visiting different schools. And then from there, Western Massachusetts didn't have a lot going on. There's a lot of extremely talented fighters here and mixed martial artists here. And they were having a hard time getting a lot of fights up north and in the east, so I decided to make a move.
Okay, so why don't you explain to people what mixed martial arts is? It's a combination of a bunch of different things.
It is. It's, there's boxing. A lot of people, when they look back at fighting, it was in a ring and it was boxing. And with boxing, there were amazing guys even out of the East that were fighting. And then there was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai, and all these different arts were being fought separately. If you look back into even the UFC and Pride was overseas, you saw a lot of guys who were Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artists fighting guys who were boxers. It was very clear that one of them was a stand-up fighter, one of them was a ground fighter. And then, we really got in the 90s into the UFC and what was going on there, and you started seeing mixed martial artists where guys started training not only in boxing, but they were training in jiu-jitsu, and they were training in all different aspects of arts, and that's where you really got, mixed martial arts, and that was done in a cage.
And if you haven't seen an MMA event or fight where, in boxing you had 4 ring posts and it was square, and I used to box and I loved boxing, and it was all, you were on your feet and you were just hitting. And you could grab a little bit, but it wasn't wrestling. Where mixed martial arts is a little bit of that and a lot of everything else. You can take the guy down to the ground, you can hit him while they're on the ground. I wish I could have done that in boxing a little bit, but especially when they were sitting on their stool in the corner, go up and smack them in between rounds. It would have gave me a heck of an advantage. So. But when you talk about, so it's a very different sport, and it's a very athletic sport. It's a combination of wrestling and boxing and everything else mixed in between. You see guys throwing kicks and roundhouse kicks and big punches, which you'll never see in a boxing ring and you won't see in a wrestling match. So you got those two sports combined in with a bunch of other stuff. And the athleticism of the people that are in there is I think unparalleled for most other sports, because you are combining all these different sports.
I think that you look at guys who play football, you look at guys who are in sports like that, and they're training extremely hard. The difference, I think, in mixed martial arts versus a sport like that, from what we see on the outside, is you have taped training camps where you see football players who are going into these camps. It's very, it's almost like viral to watch these guys start training for their seasons, etc. A lot of these martial artists are training 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. They're true athletes. And to be said, too, this isn't, me taking some guys and throwing them into a cage. This is a sanctioned event through the state, like for us would be the state of Massachusetts, where we're sanctioned and we're covered by public safety. So these guys not only are training, but they know how to safely get in that cage and fight, and they're held to it. They have to be licensed to be able to do so.
That's actually a really good point you want to make with the legal part of this, that you don't just throw them in a cage and,
we don't.
and let them have some
we
fun.
Don't. We're not allowed.
And it's interesting, as Karen mentioned, that there's women fighting in MMA, and there's boxing started to have women fighting there, and the more celebrated names were Joe Frazier's daughter and Layla Ali, and that type of thing. But mixed martial arts is not just standing up and throwing punches. These girls are mixing it up like the guys do. And it was pretty funny to see at one of the events that you had a tent over at UMass, and the students were coming up and talking to a young girl who looked like a college kid. And then when they found out that she was an MMA fighter, there was a little bit of maybe a little bit of respect there, or something that I don't know if respect or fear, that a girl could actually beat them up or something, and because they're training just as hard as the guys are training, and they're doing everything that the guys are doing, and there is no exceptions made for them, meaning there's no separate rules for women fighting in MMA as opposed to men. I mean, overall, they're still getting hit the same way and training the same way, and actually they do train with men
Yeah,
in
they
a lot
do.
of cases.
They do.
Because there's not a lot of women in the gym, so to speak, where they're all concentrated in one.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of these women, too, are, they're athletic. A lot of them have backgrounds in sports in school as well. You don't really see, you don't have wrestling backgrounds with women because that's just not something that's acceptable. I don't even think they have that in high school, that they have women who wrestle. A lot of these girls are coming back from, softball and lacrosse, all these different backgrounds in high school, and they're just tough girls in general. But they train exactly like the guys do. Some of them are training. We have 125, 130 pounders that are fighting with 185 guys, and they're able to keep up. They definitely work just as hard as the guys do. There's just not as many women fighters as there are men.
Yeah. Now, in your last show, you had a professional event mixed with amateurs, and you had a couple of big-name people from the UFC. And the UFC, if you don't know, is the Ultimate Fighting Championships, which is the big kahuna of MMA. They are it. And then there's a bunch of other smaller type of promotional companies, and then there's companies like yours that are starting out in the regional aspect and growing. And your last show had pros, but you had some people from the UFC on it. Who were they?
We had Ricardo Funch fight. Ricardo Funch actually was in the UFC, lost his fight in the UFC and got out. He then fought on our show, won his fight, and made it back to the UFC. So he's actually in the UFC now. We have amazing fighters from this area. We really do. If you look at the Northeast, we have guys like Gabriel Gonzaga. He's right here from our own backyard too. And those guys are training with the guys who are fighting here. And like you said, we're starting out at regional and national. A lot of people have tried to contend with the UFC, be the UFC. And that's just not going to happen. That's the cream of the crop. That's the top. But these guys that are in the UFC have to fight somewhere. They have to get their history somewhere, and we are those people where they get them from. So some people diminish what the local scene has to offer, but what we're offering is opportunity for fighters who have that goal, a place to fight and say, okay, I think I'm good enough to get there. So. And
what's interesting, if you want to equate that for Ricardo, it was basically being cut from a Major League Baseball team, playing independent ball, and then making it back to the Major League Baseball. So pretty big accomplishment on his part, but a bigger accomplishment on your part to have him on your show and be the impetus for him to get back into the UFC.
It was a huge honor, actually, to have him on my show. When I first started, my husband and I actually were working Need to Bleed together, and Ricardo Funch was the first guy I ever sponsored, and that was years ago. And since then he's had other sponsors, etc. But I really learned a lot about the sport from his coach and from watching them train, etc. And to have him on my show was a huge honor.
And what you're seeing typically with fighters, and it's a little bit different from what I saw when I was promoting boxing. And I boxed in high school and college. In college, there was a big college boxing scene when I was in school, which was, you still had, you wrote with the chalk in your little blackboard, like Little House on the Prairie and stuff. But the bottom line is other than collegiate boxing, there wasn't, when you looked at amateur fighting and moving up into the pros, there wasn't a great deal of those guys coming out of college and so forth. But your demographics, and the two fighters from Longmeadow are Nate and Sam Nato, who Nate's a college graduate, Sam is graduating, and so you have college kids that are actually fighting in the MMA because former lacrosse players, football players, and so forth, looking for that next challenge. So it seems like it's either MMA or you're going to run a triathlon or both or something. So the demographics of the fighters aren't just, kids from the inner city that are, it's the tough and down and out. And what you really saw in boxing, especially back in the heyday of the 40s and 50s, where it was the social economic, way to move up in the world, where in what I'm seeing anyway in MMA is it's a mix.
Mm-hmm. It is, and you bring up Sam and Nato, and he actually, a lot of people may not know, but he's actually on the top of the charts in rankings for his weight class.
As an amateur.
As an amateur.
Yep.
He actually could go pro. It's very, very difficult to find fights for him because his record is 8-2, and to get an 8-2 record in amateur is almost unheard of. But he wants to make sure he's graduated high school before he goes pro. I'm sorry. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Graduates college. And part of that is it's a huge commitment when you go pro. You know, you're having to train for 4 hours a day, you know, a few days a week. You're having to travel a little bit to get other experience and other training in. So, you know, I mean, right here you have one of the best fighters in the amateurs in Massachusetts, period. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it is. Okay. And then, so the neat thing, though, is that you have coming up is something entirely different, which hasn't been done before, especially up in anywhere north of Washington and east of Chicago, basically, which is an amateur championship challenge. And it's called the Premier FC Challenge, Amateur Challenge. So why don't you tell folks a little bit about that show, what's going to happen with it, where it's going to be, and that type of thing. Okay.
Well, we have a tournament coming up. The reason why it's different is usually when you have guys who are fighting, I'm actually a licensed matchmaker in the state as well. And when I match guys, I'm matching them for one fight. I go through their records. I go through all of their history, and I find out, is this a good match? This is a little bit different, as I'm taking 8 fighters per weight class who have similar records and history, and I'm having them fight each other. There's 4 rounds. Each round is held on a different day, 6 weeks apart. And what we're doing is the fighter, if he wins the first fight, will actually basically, for less of a better term, is pulling out of a hat for his next fight 6 weeks later. So it's really helping them and training them that you have 6 weeks to prepare for this opponent. You know, he has the same background as you. Sometimes managers can be a little bit picky, trainers can be really picky on who a guy fights. And I think this really gets them, they need this step to get to a pro level, to be able to say, okay, I have 6 weeks to prepare for this guy. This guy is pretty equal to me. I'm going to get there. And then, you know, subsequently he'll end up winning our belt at the end on the 4th day, which is the final.
And the thing about MMA is that when it comes to amateurs, you could have someone who's 3-2 as an amateur and turn pro without really having, what do I say, a resume. So it could just be 5 odd fights here or there, or 3 odd fights here or there. This tournament, by the time it's done, is the winner of each of those weight classes should be in a position to say, I now have the opportunity to turn pro because of the recognition I just received through this tournament by winning a belt and that type of thing.
Exactly. And, you know, they've won 3 fights in a row to be able to get that belt. And, you know, there's other people who I think play with the belt system. I respect the belt system very much, and part of that is in boxing. I look at some of these amateur boxers who are 100 wins, 20 losses. You know, they have huge resumes, and I respect that so much. And I think there's, you know, some people out there who use the belt system as a ploy to get people to want to fight for them. And I don't feel as though someone should just get a belt opportunity. I feel like it has to be earned. And I feel like with doing this tournament, these guys who are going to be winning the belt have earned their right to have that at an amateur level. Yeah. When they go pro, that could be held on their resume as well.
Yep. And it's a great starting point for someone who's looking to get into it as a way to the tournament to get you to that next level, even if it's the next level of amateur fighting, that you get in there because you are the champion of the Premier FC Challenge.
Exactly.
Where's the fight's going to be held?
They're at the Log Cabin in Holyoke.
Okay, so they have all those beautiful banquets in. And what we understand is there's no weddings going on at the same time the MMA fight's going on, okay?
There's definitely not.
No, because that could just, you know, you could get the bride and groom in there and a couple maybe in the wedding party get in there and have some fun. But so it's going to be at the Log Cabin in Holyoke, which is one of the premier banquet facilities in all of Western Mass, is actually going to host this MMA blood sport. No, I'm only kidding. And the only reason I say that my daughter's getting married up there. So yes, it's like a wonderful thing. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. And she asked me to make sure that there's nothing going on the day of her wedding. So that's it. Yeah.
What brides are a little bit picky about mixed martial arts on their wedding day.
Yeah, especially next door. Yeah. So they're going to be at the Log Cabin. It's 4 series in a row. The first fight's April 1st.
Yes.
And then I don't know the dates of the subsequent ones, but how do they find out about it other than looking at the posters that'll go up and that type of thing? Where would they go?
They can go to www.thepremierfc.com. We'll have all of our information there. You can buy tickets there. You can also follow us on Facebook at Premier Space FC.
Okay, and that'll be on. We'll get it on the trailer of the show. So to wrap up, and I'm really as someone who promoted boxing in that sport was considered heavily brutal at times as well. And I used to box. I love boxing. It's one of the, if you ever do it, and I played hockey and that type of thing. It's a great sport because you're in there by yourself, and I know what it takes to go train for a fight. I know what it takes to be committed to do what these people do. but it's, to me, the funniest thing is seeing a female promoter, because, you know, Karen has to get into the face of some of these big, rough, tumble guys and set them straight. And it's almost like the guy's mother's talking to him and they put their tail between their legs and walk off. And I don't mean because you're a woman, but it just, when you see that structure of you talking to someone that's, you know, looking up like that, and you just see them shake their head and walk away. It's a beautiful thing that when you're in control like that. But and what I can compliment you on is that you've done a great job in taking a brand, because there's a lot of different MMA shows. They come and they go, and it happens in boxing too. Promoter comes in, thinks I can reinvent the wheel, I can do it better than anybody else ever can, and then they find out that, oops, this is all the stuff that goes into it. And in the conditions today, from when I promoted boxing, every fighter, and Karen mentioned that it's sanctioned, that they have to have blood work done, they have to have an EKG, an EEG, and a CAT scan.
The CAT scans are for the pros.
Okay.
Once you go pro, you have to have a CAT scan, but you have to have all of your physicals done. You have to have all your blood cleared, and that's the blood is every 6 months. You have to have that pulled. You also have to be licensed through the State Athletic Commission as well as public safety. So there's a huge process in which it takes to become a fighter. So, you know, they're very careful. They're very make sure that these guys are really
so it's
healthy.
not just a physical commitment, it's a commitment of, I've got to go get all of this done and spend money to do it. And these guys are just fighting amateur, which they get $0 for.
Correct.
So again, the commitment is, I want to really do this, and it's coming out of my pocket to really do this. And, you know, maybe they're looking down the road and saying, I'll be pro and I'll make this all back, but that's not really what they're looking at this point in time. So so it is sanctioned. You know, we want to make sure that it's clear. It's not just pulling people off the street. And all this stuff has to be in well before the fights are ever even approved by the commission. So there's a lot of work that goes into behind the scenes to actually get that fight going, which is just tremendous. And plus you put on a good show. So people are going there, having some fun. And again, you're at the log cabin, plenty of free parking. It's easy to get to right off of 91. Everybody knows where that is, so that's a good thing. So we'll put the trailer on there. It's thepremierfc.com. If you have any questions, just go to the website. You can always call LCTV if you need to. Is there anything else you want to say about the show or MMA in general?
Just I hope to see everybody there, give it an opportunity. You know, we're giving that opportunity to you to see it. So come on down and check it out.
Yeah, it should be fun, especially as the fights progress and you start to go. So there's basically 4 rounds. You win the first round, 4 guys are eliminated, the next 4 advance, and so forth until they go to the championship. And so you have the 2 best of the amateur fighters fighting for it. And there's going to be some special prizes for those guys, a little added incentive, and you'll announce those as you get closer to it, or do you want to announce it now?
We can announce some of them. Actually, because they're amateur, we had to pull out variances and stuff to be able to let them be able to win prizes, because normally they're not allowed to as amateurs. They would have to go pro if we gave them anything of monetary value. So, but we're going to be giving away a belt. We're going to be giving away a trip and a bag full of gear. So.
One of the neatest things I ever did was promote a New England heavyweight title fight, and the guy who won it was a journeyman heavyweight. That belt meant so much to him that it's, I know it's hard to understand, but you know, when you're in that sport and you walk away with that belt, that's worth the money, more than the money than what you're going to pay for that belt to be made. So
absolutely.
Yeah, it's a good thing. Okay, well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Folks, if you need more information, we'll put some trailers on the screen. I hope to see you up there, because you do have you see these local fighters and are from our communities. Take a look up there. It's a great sport to watch. These guys are true athletes, and I hope to see you up there. And again, thank you for watching The Upside, and we'll catch you on the next show. Thank you.